Our guest of honor today, Mr. Mehta, Mr. Nishant Shah, Director of the Arch Foundation, Somki Shah, Founder and the Spirit of Arch Foundation, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the outset express my very, very warm thanks and gratitude to the Arch Foundation for inviting me here this morning and for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts and perspectives with all of you. Let me, Somki, begin by congratulating you on your introductory remarks, where I have found two very important mentions. Strategic CSR, how we can link CSR with the core strategy of the company, of the business, and therefore it doesn't become just a standalone item which we should admire as a trophy, but which we actually bring into the very core of the strategy of that company. Let me also mention the other point you spoke about, documentation. Two mentions here. One, I have rarely seen a conference which thinks about what happens after the conference. And this idea of actually using your card with a code which you can access all the data of this conference a week or 10 days later when that is ready is an extremely innovative and a very, very useful idea. But the second aspect of documentation is also vital because every project in CSR that you do must be documented from day one till day end. If that is not done, you cannot track the progress of that particular project, and you can never measure impact because you never know where you began with. If you don't know where you began, 3 years down the line, how will you measure impact? So documentation, sometimes neglected, becomes the very core of the CSR project. Nishant, you brought in very nice ideas and some of the things that still need to be done. And I think in the course of the day, we will reflect that over these 10 years, what has been the experience? At the end of one decade, it's a very good time to reflect on what the beginnings were, the lessons we have learned over time, and what we still need to do. Maybe, as you called it, CSR 2.0. Mehta Saab, let me turn to you and say that as somebody who literally created the CSR movement in this country, we are indebted deeply to persons like you. You don't need to be any kind of a CSR expert. When I began to write the CSR law, there was no expertise around. I myself was often asked, who is this Dr. Bhaskar Chatterjee and why is he talking about CSR? What work has he done? And the answer is exactly what you were, zero. In fact, if somebody had asked me the full expansion of the acronym CSR in 2009, I would have hesitated because it was not even currently known. So it is exactly that, the human element, as you rightly said, sir, of CSR that ignites the passion in the human being to give endlessly from the bottom of the heart, to do for others who need help. How can we bring meaning into their lives? And as Nishant was saying to me as we were climbing up the staircase, if you immerse yourself into that, you pretty much lose yourself. And the father of our nation once said that the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in the service of others. That really is the heart of what CSR is about. Let me now take your thoughts back for a bit and go back to 2009. What were the changes that really ignited our senses when we were writing the guidelines for public sector enterprises? As most of you know, strategic CSR in India begins on the 1st of April 2010, not 2014, because it is on that date that the DPE guidelines come into effect. Pretty much those 14 pages of guidelines that I wrote with my own hand formed the basis of Section 135. In fact, I was asked to convert those 14 pages of guidelines into about 120 words, which is Section 135. But more than that, there were 3 or 4 very important things that also became part of Section 135. What were those seminal changes? The thought processes which the entire world had never heard of before, never even thought of before. The finest minds in America, from where CSR begins, had never even conceived those concepts. And they're just 3 or 4. Number 1, from backroom to boardroom. Because it is corporate social responsibility, everything that you do in CSR is part of boardroom. It is board driven. It has a committee reporting to the board. The sign off of the board on the CSR projects activates all of CSR within the company. Number 2, the role of implementing agencies, which are basically civil society organizations and NGOs. And here the idea was corporates and their staff are not recruited for the purposes of staying in the villages and the communities and doing work among them. If not, then who should implement CSR? Remember that when you are writing policy, it has to be thought through from beginning to end. You cannot leave any loose ends to be tied up later. And so we wanted the NGO sector, the civil society sector, to be at the heart of CSR, which we then conceived as being part of the inclusive development of the nation, which Modi ji now calls Viksit Bharat. Many asked then to me, and particularly from the corporate side, that sir, हमारे पैसे ये चप्पल और झोले वालों को कैसे देंगे? एनजीओ सर, इनका बोर्ड आज यहाँ लगा है, कल उठाकर कहीं और लगा देंगे, इनको हम पैसे क्यों दें सर? I think of that then and I think of that now. In India we have 33 lakh NGOs, 3.3 million. We are the single biggest NGO nation of the world. And I said to corporate India, if even 10% of these so-called chappal and jholewalas are really good, that's all you need for all the CSR work that you are going to do. And these NGOs are today at the very heart of the CSR movement. I prefer to call it a movement. And I feel great pride that all of you NGO representatives who are here today, how much you are doing, how sincerely you are doing, how beautifully you are doing. And I'm so happy that I brought that innovative thinking into what our country really needed. Number 3, POP. To builders, it would seem like plaster of Paris, but that's not what it is. It was the Chatterjee connotation, percentage of profit. And the idea to me was, put your money where your mouth is. Don't give me stops and stories and narratives and PPTs and PowerPoint decks. No. How much did you spend? And transparently put it up on your website. CSR is a spending law. If you do not spend, you will not do. What you budget for and contribute from the corporate kitty, and you account for every single rupee that you spend, that is CSR. Because it is corporate money that's going into doing your CSR projects. So there was a big debate then, and people said, okay, how much should we spend? And the question came about what percentage should it be? 1 or 3 or 5 or 0.5 or whatever. And we settled on 2% because by and large the consensus of opinion was not too much, not too little. And that's how the 2% law comes into operation. And finally, transparency and accountability. Because it is corporate money, every pie is accountable for. Everything that you spend comes on your annual report and on your website. And therefore, you are duty-bound and obliged to reveal to the world what you have done with your CSR. That having been said, over the years, what have we seen? And again, there's a lot that we have seen, and there's not enough time for me to tell you. But just 3 or 4 important things that have happened. One, of course, is that in that time, we had no professionalization. If you were going into the market and looking for, let us say, a human resource person, what would you ask for? An MBA in HR, let's say, and a qualification. If you're looking for a finance person, a chartered accountant or an MBA finance, who would you look for in CSR? It was not professionalized. And therefore, and we have witnesses and our first batch representatives here from the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, we began the process of professionalization, where now you can get certificate courses on CSR. And this generation of newbies at the time are now climbing the corporate ladder. In our own Vedanta Foundation, of course now known as Anil Agarwal Foundation, we have Ritu Chingan, who we almost now promoted to board level. So we have people who are now becoming heads of CSR verticals, never heard of before. But now virtually every company worth its salt has CSR vertical with a vertical head. And that's how the importance and the profession of CSR has grown. Number two, CSR has spawned a complete ecosystem. Professionals, corporates, NGOs, people who have made lives out of CSR. And it has now, with a spending of around 33,000 crores per year, become a sector of the economy. That is how much CSR has exponentially grown from humble beginnings in 2014 to its apex now in 2025. 2-3 important points before I close. One is that when we spend money, we need to know what we have done with it. And as you rightly said, sir, when we take a project, it must also be sustainability. And again, to quote from you, what is that sustainability? When you withdraw the hand of help, that person still remains standing. We need to understand what is the impact that we have created. And therefore, social impact assessment is today the buzzword. And we are at the national level trying to develop a national template for social impact assessment. There is none yet. New things have come into our consciousness of late. One is the environment and ESG. How do we integrate it into CSR? How do we take up within CSR item 4 of Schedule 7, which I had written way back in 2011 or 12. When I didn't have SDGs, I only had the Millennium Development Goals before. But even then, we had talked about sustainability, about natural resources, about air, about water, all of the things that the planet needs to survive. And now I see that in the percentage of spending pie chart, the percentage of spending on environmental and sustainable projects has grown from about 1% to the last released figure of about 6%. It is exponentially growing. And that will happen over time because the world is understanding how important for us it is to treasure our natural resources and to sustain them. Of late, artificial intelligence, digitization, IT have become almost across the board. And these are things we are now incorporating more and more into the way that CSR evolves. Simple example. Much of the monitoring that we do on CSR projects was about fortnightly reporting or monthly reporting. There was no way to get real-time data on the ground. But now we have tools because of AI, and I know that CSR heads actually have tools on their mobiles where they can track the progress report of the previous day on a particular project. Real-time live data emanating from the field. It also gets converted into charts and graphs and easy to understand the meaning of where that project is going. All of that is being integrated into the way that CSR is working today. We are bringing more and more sophisticated tools to deal with particular CSR problems. These are some of the things that are happening. Much more also is happening. We'll discuss it in the course of the day. But I thought that in this address to you, let me just encapsulate some of those moments and these moments and put it all together for you. Thank you for giving me the patience.